Okay, and I'm rolling.
Okay, well, Gustavo, I can just ask you to introduce yourself, just giving your name and the name of the organization you represent.
I'm Gustavo Fonseca. I'm the head of natural resources at the Global Environment Facility, which is a financial mechanism of this convention as well as the other main convention.
I mean, financial mechanisms, obviously, and financing in general is something we're talking about a lot here in Doha. First, just to kind of simplify things for those who don't know the situation,
Right.
Where does the money come from? Will there be enough financing as presumably the effects of climate change become ever more severe in the near and long distance future? How does it work?
Well, our money comes from public sources. Of course, the money that will be needed to take care of this problem is not only public funding. Actually, public funding will have to end up being a minor fraction of that. But our piece is actually to mobilize public funding and to enable developing countries to meet their obligations to conventions such as the Climate Change Convention, as well as the Convention on Biodiversity and the Convention to Combat Desertification. So what we do is to try to bring those needs of developing countries as negotiated in processes like this to the attention of the donors, and we develop strategies, and then we try to fundraise with them to put those resources for good use. The question is, how do we bring that resource to scale, the scale that's necessary? Because the fiscal situation of the world, particularly of donor countries these days, is not the most conducive of expanding the availability of public funding. So what we need to learn how to do more is, number one, getting the money to where it's most needed, start to do some prioritization so that we can address the first needs first, as opposed to spreading the resources too thinly and not getting global environmental benefits in response to this. And the other, which I think is the most promising one, is looking at all the Rio conventions for their linkages, because we need to provide financing for all of these very related topics that at the end of the day, on the ground, will have to manifest themselves by exploring the linkages that exist between biodiversity conservation and management, livelihoods, climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation to ecosystem-based approaches. So it's all interlinked, and the fact that we left Rio in '92 originally with a very fragmented political agenda, it was necessary, but now we need to bring them back together, because this is the only way that we're going to save on management costs at the same time that we gain on the scale and the impact of what we do.
I mean, this question of linkages of one element to another, as the climate change debate has grown and grown since 1992, and it really has grown, obviously, with more and more countries being involved, more and more NGOs, more and more sectors of society. Presumably, as you solve some problems, others are always arising as more and more people become aware. You always become victims of your own success in a way, as more and more people become involved in the debate as they should be. It gets more complicated, presumably.
It gets more complicated because the problem is actually growing, it's not going the other direction. But we also need to learn what we did well, because we've done an analysis of our portfolio, like for example in biodiversity, and we saw that the magnitude of the threat to biodiversity has grown since '92. We didn't meet the targets that we were set for 2010. But if we look at it prospectively, if facilities like the GEF didn't exist, the problem would be much worse than what it is. This means that we know how to do it if we have the resources that are needed to solve the problem. But that's not enough, because again, if we try to do this in isolation also from the development sector, and one of the things that we're trying to do with the GEF now is trying to mainstream all of these environmental issues that are key for what we are trying to do here into the development sector, into the agricultural sector, into the trade sector, because these are the areas that we are bound to amplify the money that we put into the systems for specific projects. Without that, we're still going to be siloed in these very limited projects and very limited interventions that in themselves are very good, but it doesn't rise up to the scale that's necessary. And we need to do something immediately, because we can't wait until 2020. And the negotiations are what they are. They will go at the pace that they will eventually turn out to be. But we can't wait until 2020 to act, because by then it's going to be too late for a number of features that are very, very crucial for the global environment and for the livelihoods of people. And therefore, we need to start implementing right now. So I think that the priority for this convention is actually implementation. And implementation is actually what we do. It's actually to provide financing for these agreements to actually take root and take and express themselves in the real world, in the developing countries where a lot of these challenges are being faced with.
I mean, do you find that processes like this at COP18, where 190 odd countries are represented, many NGOs, other social groups, do they help that process of implementation, or do they hinder it to some degree?
I think they help a lot. And if you take, for example, the outcomes of Rio + 20. Rio + 20 was not a convention itself, but it was a very interesting forum where you saw that while these conventions move slowly in negotiating global accords, there are lots and lots of great initiatives, some of them with quite a scalable impact at the regional scale, the national scale. They are being implemented, there are being resources mobilized, but it's actually happening almost outside of the knowledge of negotiators sometimes. So we are failing to learn from what is happening as we speak when we negotiate these long, very difficult political topics. And sometimes when you take too long to negotiate, the issue actually loses its currency. For example, we negotiated for almost 15 years in the CBD a very interesting concept, which is the access and benefit sharing arising from the utilization of genetic resources, which is a very promising area to really reward assets that are in the hands of developing countries by providing them with technology to use them more effectively. But the negotiations actually were concentrated on aspects of technology that are totally out of today are totally outdated. And so we are regulating sometimes things that don't exist anymore. That's because it's so slow. So we need to be able to provide a way to have some entry points into negotiations, and that goes back to your original question. These groups actually, they bring this innovation, they bring this, these disruptive technologies or disruptive initiatives that should make the negotiations more dynamic and more towards what needs to be done right now, because we can't wait. And again, the process will go for as long as it will go, but this doesn't mean that we can't do things that are very, very effective today.
What would you like to see what would you like to see this meeting, this COP18, achieve by the end of this week that would make your task easier?
Well, if the parties agree finally to have a path forward towards a global agreement, that's what we need to unlock several important strategies. For example, the RED+ strategy, this has been on the works for a long time. Again, it's being implemented in many cases at the subnational scales in many places, but we don't have an international accord that will create the necessary